Behind the scarlet uniform and stoic expression stands a man who once cried in a palace bathroom after a little girl with cancer asked him if he was really a toy soldier. Behind the rigid posture and unwavering discipline lives someone who has held the trembling hand of a dying veteran while cameras rolled, thinking no one would notice. Behind the ceremony and tradition breathes a human being who has laughed, wept, and loved in the shadows of the world's most watched doorway. The royal guard you think you know, silent, unmoving, untouchable, is about to reveal a side that will shatter every assumption you've ever made. These are not statues in red coats. These are fathers, sons, brothers, and protectors whose hearts beat with the same hopes and fears as your own. Their stories will make you laugh until your sides hurt, cry until your chest aches, and believe again in the quiet heroism that exists in the most unexpected places. What you're about to discover will change how you see every uniform, every ceremony, and every moment of silent service. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the most ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they think no one is watching. James Mitchell never imagined that a 6-year-old girl in a pink wheelchair would become the reason he almost broke protocol for the first time in his 15-year career. But there she was on that crisp Tuesday morning in October, her tiny hands pressed against the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, her eyes wide with wonder as she stared at him through the bars. The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of London traffic, but James stood motionless in his scarlet tunic, the familiar weight of his bearskin hat creating a small shadow over his eyes. His rifle rested against his shoulder with practiced ease, every muscle in his body trained to maintain the perfect posture that tourists from around the world came to photograph. "Mummy, why won't the soldier look at me?" the little girl whispered, her voice carrying that particular innocence that only children possess. James had heard thousands of similar questions over the years. Children wondering if he was real, tourists trying to make him laugh, teenagers attempting to get a reaction. He had mastered the art of selective hearing, of being present but untouchable, of serving as both protector and living monument to tradition. But something in this child's voice was different. Perhaps it was the slight raspiness that spoke of medical procedures and hospital stays. Perhaps it was the way her mother's hand trembled as she adjusted the blanket across her daughter's legs. Or perhaps it was simply that after 15 years of standing guard, James had finally reached the moment when his humanity could no longer be contained within the rigid boundaries of duty. The mother knelt beside the wheelchair, her voice gentle but heavy with exhaustion. "He's working, sweetheart. The soldier has a very important job protecting the Queen." "But I just want to say hello," the girl replied, her small fingers tracing the intricate ironwork of the gate. "I'd been waiting all morning." James knew the rules by heart. No breaking character. No interaction with the public beyond necessary security measures. No acknowledgement of personal requests. These weren't suggestions, they were the foundation upon which centuries of royal tradition rested. Yet as he stood there, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back from hours of motionless duty, something inside him shifted. This wasn't about breaking rules or abandoning tradition. This was about remembering why those traditions existed in the first place, to serve something greater than himself, to protect and honor not just a building or a person, but the very spirit of service that connected him to every citizen he swore to defend. The girl's mother was speaking now, her voice barely audible but filled with the kind of desperate hope that James recognized from his own childhood when his father had been deployed overseas. "Emma has been looking forward to this visit for months. She's been so brave through all her treatments, and seeing the guards was the one thing she asked for." James felt his chest tighten. Emma. The child had a name, a story, a life full of struggles he could only imagine. Behind his stoic expression, memories of his own daughter flickered through his mind. Lucy, now 12 years old, who still waited up for him on the nights when his shifts ended late, who drew pictures of him in his red uniform and hung them on her bedroom wall. The tourists continued to flow around the small scene, some pausing to take photographs, others walking past without a second glance. But James found his attention completely focused on the little girl in the pink wheelchair who had somehow managed to see past his uniform to the person beneath. Emma's mother was preparing to leave, gently turning the wheelchair away from the gates. "Come on, darling. Maybe we can see the guards from the park instead." But Emma resisted, her small hands gripping the wheels of her chair. "Please, Mummy. Just one more minute." I think he heard me. And, in that moment, James realized that she was right. He had heard her, not just her words, but everything she hadn't said. The hope in her voice, the determination that kept her sitting upright despite obvious fatigue, the pure joy that radiated from her simply at being in this place, at this moment. The next few seconds felt like hours. James weighed 15 years of perfect service against the simple human desire to bring joy to a child who clearly had known too little of it. He thought of his commanding officers, of the tourists watching, of the traditions he had sworn to uphold. And, then, he thought of his own daughter, of the pride in her eyes when she told her friends that her daddy was one of the Queen's Guards. What would he want someone to do if Lucy were the one in that wheelchair? The answer came to him with startling clarity. James took one small step forward, then another, moving with the measured precision that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training. But, instead of his usual patrol pattern, he was walking directly toward the gate where Emma waited. The crowd around him seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Conversations quieted, cameras were raised, and a circle of onlookers formed without anyone quite understanding why. James stopped directly in front of Emma's wheelchair, separated from her only by the ornate iron bars of the gate. For the first time in hours, he allowed his eyes to move from their fixed forward position and looked down into the face of the little girl who had somehow reached through all his training and touched something real inside him. Emma's eyes grew impossibly wide. Her mouth formed a perfect O of surprise, and, for a moment, she seemed too stunned to speak. Then, with the resilience that children possess in abundance, she found her voice. "Hello, soldier," she whispered, her small hand reaching through the bars toward him. James looked at that tiny outstretched hand, pale from months of indoor treatments, adorned with a hospital bracelet that spoke of battles no child should have to fight. He glanced quickly around, noting the position of the security cameras, the distance to his fellow guards, the growing crowd of witnesses. Then, he did something that would later be viewed millions of times on social media, that would be written about in newspapers across the world, and that would remind people everywhere that behind every uniform beats the heart of someone capable of extraordinary compassion. James slowly, carefully, reached through the bars and took Emma's hand in his own. The crowd gasped. Camera flashes flickered like stars. Someone in the gathering crowd whispered, "Oh my God, did you see that?" But James was aware of none of it. In that moment, his entire world had narrowed to the feeling of tiny fingers gripping his own, to the smile that transformed Emma's face from wan to radiant, to the tears that rolled down her mother's cheeks as she watched her daughter experience pure, uncomplicated joy. They stood that way for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Emma squeezed his hand with surprising strength, and James squeezed back gently, pouring all of his care and protection into that simple gesture. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice full of wonder. "You're the nicest soldier in the whole world." James felt his throat constrict with emotions he hadn't expected. Still maintaining his hold on her hand, he did something else that broke protocol but honored something far more important than rules. He winked at her. Emma giggled, a sound like silver bells that seemed to ring across the courtyard and into the hearts of everyone who heard it. In that laugh was the essence of childhood, of hope, of the belief that the world was full of magic and kindness if you just knew where to look for it. Slowly, reluctantly, James released her hand and took a step back. He returned to his position, his face resuming its professional composure, his eyes once again focused straight ahead. But something fundamental had changed. The uniform was the same, the duty unchanged, but the man wearing both had been transformed by a moment of pure human connection. Emma's mother mouthed thank you to him, tears still streaming down her face. She began to push the wheelchair away from the gates, but Emma turned back one last time. "Bye, soldier. I'll remember you forever." As they disappeared into the crowd, James felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his heavy wool uniform. He had broken protocol, yes. He might face questions from his superiors, disciplinary action, or worse. But he had also remembered something crucial that years of training had threatened to bury, that service wasn't just about following rules or maintaining traditions. It was about recognizing the moments when being human mattered more than being perfect. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of tourists and photographs, but James found himself scanning every face in the crowd, hoping to catch another glimpse of pink wheelchair wheels or hear that silver bell laugh. When his replacement arrived at the end of his duty, James walked to the barracks with a spring in his step that hadn't been there in months. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table helping Lucy with her mathematics homework, his daughter looked up at him with knowing eyes. "You look different today, Daddy." "Happy different." James smiled, thinking of Emma's tiny hand in his, of the reminder that beneath every uniform, every role, every responsibility, there lived a person capable of making choices that mattered. "I met someone special today," he told his daughter. "Someone who reminded me why I love my job." He never told Lucy about breaking protocol. He never mentioned the risk he had taken or the consequences he might face. Instead, he simply held her a little tighter during their bedtime hug and promised himself that he would never forget the lesson Emma had taught him, that sometimes the most important duty of all is simply to be human. 3 days after his encounter with Emma, James arrived at the barracks to find his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, waiting for him with an expression that could have frozen the Thames. James had spent the past 72 hours wondering when this moment would come, rehearsing explanations that seemed increasingly inadequate in the face of decades of military precision and protocol. "Mitchell," the colonel's voice carried the weight of authority earned through 30 years of service. "My office. Now." The walk down the narrow corridor felt longer than usual, each step echoing against walls lined with photographs of guards who had served before him. James wondered if his own picture would soon be absent from these halls, if one moment of human compassion would end a career he had built with pride and dedication. Colonel Harrison closed the door behind them and moved to his desk, where a tablet displayed a frozen image that James recognized immediately, himself, reaching through the gate, his hand clasped with Emma's. The photograph had been taken from a distance, but the emotion in the moment was unmistakable. "Do you know what this is, Mitchell?" The colonel's tone was unreadable. "Yes, sir." "A breach of protocol on my part, sir." "A breach of protocol." Harrison repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them. "That's one way to describe it." James straightened his shoulders, prepared for whatever consequence awaited him. He had known the risks when he chose to reach through those gates. He had accepted that his career might end because a little girl needed to feel seen, to feel important, to experience a moment of magic in what had clearly been a difficult journey. "I take full responsibility for my actions, sir. I understand that maintaining discipline and protocol is essential to our function, and I accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his weathered fingers drumming against the desk. Then, to James's complete surprise, the older man began to laugh, not the harsh bark of military discipline, but something warmer, more human. "Do you know what happened after your little breach of protocol, Mitchell?" James shook his head, genuinely confused by the colonel's reaction. "That photograph has been shared over 2 million times across social media platforms. The BBC ran a feature story about it this morning. I've received calls from newspaper reporters, morning television shows, and at least 6 different charity organizations. But, more importantly, I've received a call from the palace." James felt his stomach drop. A call from the palace could only mean one thing: that his moment of compassion had created an international incident, that he had embarrassed the very institution he had sworn to protect. The Queen, Colonel Harrison continued, his expression growing more serious, wanted to know the name of the guard who reminded the world that service and humanity are not mutually exclusive. The words hit James like a physical blow. Not a reprimand. Not a dismissal. Recognition from the highest levels of the institution he served. "Sir," Harrison raised a hand to stop him. "Let me finish." Her Majesty was particularly moved by the fact that you chose compassion over protocol when faced with a child in need. She asked me to convey her personal appreciation for your actions and to ensure that you understand how your moment of humanity has reflected positively on the entire Guard. James felt his legs grow weak. He had spent 3 days preparing for the end of his career, and instead he was being told that he had honored it. However, the colonel's tone grew stern again. "We cannot have guards breaking protocol whenever they feel moved to do so. What you did was right in that moment, for that child, but it cannot become a precedent that undermines the discipline and tradition that define our service." "I understand completely, sir." "I'm not sure you do." Harrison stood and walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard where Emma's encounter had taken place.
What you did has started something we didn't expect. That little girl's story, Emma Morrison, diagnosed with leukemia 6 months ago, has captured public attention in a way that none of us anticipated. Her mother has been interviewed by every major news outlet in the country.
James listened with growing amazement as the colonel continued. Emma told the reporters that meeting you was better than any medicine she'd ever received. She said that knowing there were real heroes in the world made her feel brave enough to face her next round of treatments. Her oncologist says her spirits have improved dramatically since your encounter. The weight of his actions was beginning to dawn on James. What had felt like a simple moment between a guard and a child had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. But that's not the most remarkable part, Harrison continued. The attention your story has received has led to an unprecedented surge in donations to childhood cancer research. The Emma's Heroes Fund, established by her mother just 2 days ago, has already raised over £50,000. The photograph of you two has become a symbol of hope for families dealing with childhood illness across the country. James sank into the chair across from the colonel's desk, overwhelmed by the cascade of consequences that had flowed from one moment of human connection. There's more, Harrison said, returning to his seat. We've received requests from over a dozen hospitals and care facilities, asking if guards might be available for special visits to patients. The Ministry of Defense is considering establishing an official community outreach program based on the response to your actions.
The irony wasn't lost on James.
By breaking the rules, he had potentially created new ones that would allow future guards to engage in similar acts of service and compassion.
What does this mean for me, sir? For my position here?
Colonel Harrison was quiet for several seconds, studying James with the calculating gaze of someone weighing complex decisions. It means, Mitchell, that you've reminded all of us why we serve. Not just to maintain traditions or follow protocols, but to represent the very best of what our nation stands for. Compassion, service, and the willingness to put the needs of others before our own comfort or convenience. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a letter bearing an official seal. This is a commendation from Her Majesty, recognizing your exceptional service and judgment. It will become part of your permanent record, and you should know that it's the first of its kind issued to a serving guard for actions taken outside of ceremonial duty. James accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of the paper seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what it represented: validation that his choice had been not just personally right, but institutionally supported. However, the colonel continued, we need to discuss how we move forward from here. The attention your actions have received means that you'll likely be recognized by the public whenever you're on duty.
We need to ensure that this doesn't become a distraction from your primary responsibilities.
Over the next hour, James and Colonel Harrison worked out the details of his continued service. He would remain in his current position, but would also be asked to participate in carefully planned community outreach events. The Guard was developing new protocols that would allow for limited interaction with the public in specific circumstances, particularly involving sick children or veterans. As James prepared to leave the colonel's office, Harrison called him back.
One more thing, Mitchell. Emma's mother called this morning. The family would like to invite you to attend Emma's birthday party next month.
It's not an official event, and you would be attending as yourself, not as a representative of the Guard.
I told her I would pass along the invitation.
James felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. The thought of seeing Emma again, healthy and happy and celebrating another year of life, filled him with a joy he hadn't expected.
I would be honored, sir. I thought you might feel that way.
Take the rest of the day off, Mitchell. Spend time with your family.
I have a feeling that the next few weeks are going to be quite busy for you.
As James walked home through the familiar streets of London, he found himself noticing things he had overlooked for years. Children playing in small parks, elderly couples walking hand in hand, teenagers laughing at bus stops. Each face he passed reminded him that behind his uniform, he was part of a community that extended far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace.
When he arrived home, Lucy met him at the door with excitement bubbling in her voice. Daddy!
I saw you on the telly. My teacher showed our whole class the picture of you holding that little girl's hand. James knelt down to his daughter's level, seeing his own reflection in her proud eyes.
And, what did you think about that?
I thought you were brilliant, Lucy said without hesitation.
The little girl looked so happy. And, all my friends think my dad is a hero now.
As James hugged his daughter, he realized that the greatest reward for his actions wasn't the commendation from the Queen or the positive media attention. It was seeing his own child understand that true service meant being willing to break the rules when breaking them was the right thing to do. That evening, as James helped Lucy practice piano in their small living room, she stopped mid-song and looked at him with the serious expression she wore when wrestling with important thoughts.
Daddy, will you tell me about the little girl? Emma?
So James told her about Emma's courage, about her mother's love, about the magic that could happen when someone chose compassion over convenience. He told her about the ripple effects of kindness, about how one small act could spread outward in ways that touched lives he would never meet. And, as he spoke, James realized that Emma had given him something far more valuable than the moment of connection they had shared. She had reminded him that every day brought opportunities to choose between following rules and following his heart, and that the most important service he could provide was to never stop believing that those moments of choice mattered.
The next morning, James would return to his post at the palace gates.
He would wear the same red uniform, carry the same rifle, stand with the same disciplined posture. But he would also carry with him the knowledge that beneath the ceremony and tradition, he was part of something larger, a community of people committed to protecting not just buildings or institutions, but the very best parts of human nature itself. And if another child in a wheelchair appeared at those gates, James knew exactly what he would do. 6 months after his encounter with Emma, James stood in a hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and hope, wearing civilian clothes that felt strange after so many years in uniform. In his hands he held a small wrapped gift, a music box that played London Bridge is Falling Down when opened, inside of which sat a miniature figure of a royal guard standing at attention. Emma's birthday party had been moved from her family's home to the children's ward of Great Ormond Street Hospital, where she was undergoing her final round of treatments. The corridor buzzed with the controlled chaos of medical professionals, visiting families, and the particular energy that hospitals possess, a mixture of anxiety, hope, determination, and love compressed into sterile spaces. Through the open door of Emma's room, James could hear laughter and the rustle of wrapping paper. When Emma's mother, Sarah, spotted him in the doorway, her face lit up with recognition and gratitude.
Emma, look who's here.
The little girl looked up from a pile of presents, and, for a moment, James barely recognized her. Gone was the pale, fragile child in the pink wheelchair. In her place sat a vibrant 7-year-old with bright eyes and a mischievous grin, her hair growing back in soft curls that framed her face like a halo.
It's my soldier, Emma announced to the room full of family and friends. I told everyone you would come.
James had expected this reunion to be emotional, but he hadn't prepared for the overwhelming surge of joy that filled his chest at seeing Emma so clearly thriving. The beeping monitors and lines couldn't diminish the life force that seemed to radiate from her small frame.
Happy birthday, Emma, James said, presenting his gift. I brought you something special.
As Emma unwrapped the music box, James was introduced to the extended circle of people who had become part of her story. There was her father, Mark, who worked nights as a taxi driver to pay for treatments not covered by the NHS. Her older brother Danny, who had shaved his own head in solidarity when Emma lost her hair. Her grandmother, who had moved in to help with daily care and had become Emma's constant companion during hospital stays. But it wasn't just family filling the small room. There were nurses who had gone beyond their duties to make Emma's treatments bearable, fellow patients who had become friends and support systems, and volunteers from the various charities that had embraced Emma's story as a symbol of hope.
This room represents something extraordinary, Dr.
Patricia Wells, Emma's oncologist, told James as they watched Emma demonstrate her music box to a captivated audience. When your story went public, it didn't just raise money for research.
It created a community.
Emma has received thousands of letters from children around the world, drawings from school classes, and support from families dealing with similar challenges. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself pulled into conversations that revealed the broader impact of his moment of connection with Emma. Sarah told him about the family she had met through the Emma's Heroes Fund, about children whose treatments were now possible because of donations inspired by a photograph of a guard and a little girl holding hands. "You have no idea how many people you've helped," Sarah said during a quiet moment.
But it's not just the money, though that's been incredible. It's the hope.
The reminder that there are good people in the world who care about strangers, who will reach through barriers to offer comfort.
James listened to story after story of ripple effects he had never imagined.
A teacher in Manchester who had shown the photograph to her class had inspired a school-wide fundraiser that helped 3 local families with medical expenses. A veteran in Scotland, reminded of his own service through James's actions, had volunteered at a children's hospital and discovered a new sense of purpose in retirement. Most remarkably, other Royal Guards had begun finding their own ways to connect with the public while maintaining their essential duties. Thomas Wright, a colleague from James's unit, had developed a subtle system of acknowledging children who approached the gates, a barely perceptible nod, a slight shift in posture that let them know they were seen. Margaret Foster, one of the few female guards, had been photographed sharing her umbrella with an elderly tourist during a sudden downpour, creating another viral moment of humanity breaking through protocol. "You started something," Emma's grandmother told James as the party began to wind down. "You reminded people that rules are important, but people are more important." As the celebration concluded and families began to leave, James found himself alone with Emma for a few precious minutes. She was tired from the excitement but glowing with happiness, the music box clutched protectively in her small hands. "The doctor says I get to go home soon," Emma told him, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that soon had been a long time coming.
"Mummy says we can visit you at the palace when I'm all better."
"I would love that," James replied.
"But, Emma, I need you to know something important. Do you remember when we first met, when you said I was the nicest soldier in the whole world?" Emma nodded solemnly.
"Well, meeting you made me want to be worthy of that description.
You taught me something very important, that being a good soldier isn't just about following orders.
It's about remembering who we're serving and why their happiness and safety matter more than any rulebook."
Emma considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important concepts. "Does that mean you help other children now too?"
"Yes, it does.
Because of you, I learned that my uniform doesn't just represent tradition and duty.
It represents the promise that there are people who will stand up for what's right, who will offer protection and comfort when it's needed most." Emma smiled and carefully placed the music box on her bedside table, then surprised James by climbing out of bed and wrapping her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered into his shirt.
"Thank you for helping me feel brave."
As James returned Emma's hug, he realized that she had articulated something he had been struggling to understand for months. His role as a Royal Guard had always been about protection and service, but he had interpreted that in the narrowest possible terms: protecting buildings, serving protocols, maintaining distance from those he was sworn to defend. Emma had taught him that true protection sometimes meant breaking down barriers instead of maintaining them. True service sometimes meant choosing compassion over protocol. And the greatest strength he could offer was not his ability to stand motionless for hours, but his willingness to reach across divides when someone needed to feel seen, valued, and protected. When James finally left the hospital that evening, he walked through London with a perspective that had been fundamentally altered by his relationship with one small girl and her enormous impact on his understanding of duty. The next morning, he returned to his post at Buckingham Palace with renewed purpose. The familiar weight of his uniform no longer felt like a constraint that separated him from the world around him. Instead, it felt like a bridge, a symbol that connected him to every person who looked to figures in uniform for protection, inspiration, and hope. During his shift that day, James noticed things he had previously overlooked. A young father lifting his toddler son to get a better view over the crowd, explaining in patient detail the significance of the guards and their role. An elderly woman in a wheelchair, accompanied by what appeared to be her adult daughter, both studying the palace with expressions of wonder and respect. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip, their teacher using the guards as an example of dedication and service to something greater than oneself. Each of these moments represented an opportunity not to break protocol, but to embody the values that protocol was meant to protect. James found ways to acknowledge these visitors while maintaining his duties, a subtle nod to the father teaching his son about service, a gentle adjustment of posture that allowed the elderly woman in the wheelchair to see him more clearly, a moment of perfect stillness that gave the schoolchildren a clear view of what dedication looked like in practice. These were small acts, barely noticeable to casual observers. But James had learned from Emma that small acts could create enormous ripples, that moments of connection could spread outward in ways that touched lives he would never meet. As his shift ended and he walked back to the barracks, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this understanding. 6 months ago, he had been a competent guard focused on following rules and maintaining traditions. Today, he was something more, a protector who understood that his greatest service came not from his ability to remain distant and untouchable, but from his willingness to remain human while wearing the uniform of duty. That evening, as James sat at his kitchen table helping Lucy with her homework, she looked up from her mathematics problems with a question that had clearly been on her mind.
"Daddy, do you think Emma will remember you when she grows up?"
James considered the question seriously, thinking about the complexity of childhood memory and the way significant moments could fade or transform over time.
"I don't know if she'll remember the details," he finally answered.
"But I hope she'll remember the feeling that when she needed someone to see her, someone did. That when she felt small and scared, she discovered she had the power to bring out the best in people around her."
Lucy nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's more important than remembering anyway. Feeling like you matter."
As James helped his daughter complete her homework, he marveled at the wisdom that children possessed, their ability to cut through complexity and identify the essential truth at the heart of any situation. Emma had mattered, not because she was sick or brave or particularly special, but simply because she was a human being who needed to feel seen and valued. That recognition had transformed not just James's understanding of his role as a royal guard, but his approach to every interaction in his daily life. He had become someone who looked for opportunities to help others feel seen, valued, and protected, whether he was wearing a red uniform and standing at palace gates, or sitting in civilian clothes at his daughter's school concert, or grocery shopping on weekends with his family. The legacy of his encounter with Emma wasn't the media attention or the commendation from the Queen, though both had been meaningful in their own ways. The real legacy was the daily choice to remember that behind every uniform, every role, every responsibility, there lived a person with the power to make the world a little more compassionate, one small act at a time. And, in a children's hospital room across London, a little girl fell asleep to the gentle melody of "London Bridge is Falling Down," her music box guard standing watch over her dreams, a reminder that some bridges, the ones built of kindness and human connection, are strong enough to last forever.